If you believe some of the superhero films of this year are some of the worst films of the year, well, they got nothing on Max Steel. Hell, Fantastic Four, or Fan Four Stick as some people call it, it is a masterpiece compared to Max Steel. Let that sink in for you. So, Max Steel is another franchise, or, oh god, I hate to call it franchise. Let's just say it's a movie for now, because hopefully there won't be a sequel. Let's just say Max Steel is a film, another film out there based off of a toy, or originally started off as a toy. Or maybe it was a cartoon first, because it was like a 2001, or is it the 90s or something like that? I forget the year because I never watched any of the Max Steels. Maybe the original cartoon coincided with the toys. Eventually it was rebooted, I believe in 2013 as another cartoon, and now this movie is based off of that cartoon version, the rebooted version with aliens and turbo energy and conspiracies. So what is Max Steel about? Well, it's about this kid, or he's supposed to be a teenager. He's supposed to be in high school, I believe, though he looks more appropriate for college. They should have just changed it to college. It would have made complete sense. But anyways, a kid that's only living with his mother because his dad died in a horrible accident at a factory, or not factory, more like he was a scientist, so it's a bunch of labs and scientific laboratory. He died in a terrible twister, tornado or something like that. Yeah, it was a tornado that destroyed the labs and killed him, which I won't go into spoilers, so that's why I'm calling it a tornado for now. They've been moving from place to place, but finally they go back to their hometown, which Max doesn't really remember because he was so young, but they're back in their hometown, and they're gonna live there. Well, right off the bat, he starts discovering that he might have some very weird powers. So, of course, this is a superhero origin story about a boy or kid or teenager, even though it should be college student, is developing powers and has to learn control, has to learn how to be a superhero, and has a companion robot. Well, parasitic life form alien that's robotic sort of thing. And they have to learn to work together, have to understand that they have to stay together because there's some complications I won't get too much into. And they have to discover what really happened to the father. How did he really die? So let's get into the good, because I do admit there are some good things in this film. For one, despite it being a low-budget film, or I believe it's a low-budget film, it looks like it has the quality of such, at least with the camera work and the lighting, and a bunch of it feels, and the acting, of course, it all feels like it's low-budget, but I do admit the CGI looks way better than most low-budget films. There's been so many low-budget films where the CGI is so cartoony, so terrible, I'm surprised it gets into theaters. But for this instance, the CGI is actually watchable. It is good, and there are times where I was actually impressed with the CGI. With the tornado monster thing, and Steel himself looking really good. I'm not a fan of the suits, but I do like the CGI and the visuals in this film. And I will say I wasn't completely bored in this film. This film really went by fast. It's only 92 minutes long. Actually, all three of the movies I saw on Tuesday were all 92 minutes exactly. So at least it was a quick watch. So it went by fast. There was enough interesting things within it, a lot of premises that could work, and enough that kept my interest, and I wasn't really all that bored watching it. Granted, I was emotionless throughout the film. I didn't feel any sort of real soul or depth or complexity to it. And so I was just watching it with no real emotions, no real attachment to the film, just a few interesting premises here and there. And I will say there are plenty of things that feel like it could have worked in a better film. It could have actually worked, and it was just executed really badly. As far as the acting goes, I wasn't really annoyed with it. I wasn't feeling like there was a lot of bad acting involved in the film. It was just the characters themselves that were really bland for the most part. Take, for instance, Max Steel's character. The way he was written, the way he was presented in the film, and the way the actor portrayed him was bland. He was just blah. He was just sort of stale throughout the movie. Heck, there are instances where you think he would be excited that he's got these really crazy powers. Maybe he'd be a little shocked. Maybe he'd be like, wow. Maybe he'd be excited. But there's some times when he learns he has these powers and he just sort of goes, huh. Like, there's times where it feels like he should have more emotion and he doesn't really have anything. Doesn't really react all that well, other than looking at his hands blankly. And it's not to say his entire performance is like that. There are many times where he does feel blank and very stale and just sort of bleh. But there are some moments where he does lighten up and he actually seems like he's a normal human being. Everyone else's performances was pretty serviceable. It wasn't anything amazing, wasn't anything over the top and funny, wasn't anything really terrible and annoying, just sort of just doing their job, basically. Basically nothing noteworthy enough to be considered really bad or really good, just serviceable, I guess. And to be honest, I think there's some really good snippets of good chemistry between certain actors and actresses throughout the film. There is an essence of a good motherly bond between her son and a son between his mother. There's snippets of good chemistry between our main actor and our lead actress, who's the romantic love of his life. Like, I feel these two do have chemistry and could do well together in a film, but the romance that's set up through this movie is really forced and comes, and isn't really developed in a natural, cohesive, and believable way. I mean, pretty much throughout this film, she constantly almost runs him over with her truck. In fact, that's how they first meet. The love interest is driving her truck, he's riding his bike to school, and she nearly hits him, and he swerves and flies off of his bike because he hits one of the bike parking rails, or what are they called? Are they just bike rails? He hits them and flies over the top. And whenever they try to go on a date with each other, basically he runs away. The date's going fine, and then something happens to him and he has to leave, or someone's around and he has to get away from them. Basically, he's always running off, and somehow it works and they become boyfriend and girlfriend. I don't know, the situations they present in the movie to build up this romantic relationship doesn't feel like it would really happen. Well, I know it's a movie, and things like this don't really happen. Well, I'm sure they don't normally happen. But the way it's presented in the movie makes it feel like, yeah, there's no way she's gonna fall in love with this guy who keeps running away from her, even though she might feel pity for him because she continually almost runs over him with her truck. And maybe it wouldn't be believable that he'd like a person that keeps constantly almost running him over. I don't know, it's just, there's something about it that feels like this romance is forced, even though the actors themselves have chemistry together from time to time. And I think there's an interesting relationship between Max and the robot Steel. There's something there. There's something very interesting. He's this parasite. He releases this energy, and if he builds it up too much, well, I'm talking about Max here. Max has this energy. Yeah, this is his power, apparently. He has turbo energy within him, and he can absorb it, and he dispels it, and if he has too much of it, he could explode, and so Steel's this parasite, sort of robotic creature that can help him calm the turbo energy inside, make sure it doesn't build up too much that he explodes, because Steel eats this turbo energy, and there's something interesting there, okay? There's something neat, but the way the movie plays it out, it almost like brushes it aside sometimes. And the whole amnesia thing and making it seem like maybe Steel is responsible for the father's death is a really forced way for the two to part ways, like in a buddy cop movie, you know, where two partners are on the opposite side of the spectrum, and then there's usually always a fight like before the third act of the film, and then they get together and fight the bad guy. It's really forced in this movie. Mainly because we as the audience can already predict before Max Steel who the real villain is and what really happens. Like, we already get it. We already figure out the flashbacks just from the little segments they show, and we're like, oh, we've seen movies like this before. We understand how movies work. We know exactly who the villain is. This is how it happened. And it's like, it makes it look like Max Steel is really dumb. Well, sorry. He's not really Max Steel. Why do I keep calling him Max Steel? Because it's Max and Steel. He's actually Max McGrath or something? Yeah, McGrath. Which is funny because the film forgets that. There's that one point, I think it's during the flashback sequence, when they finally show all the pieces together and finally is like, okay, for all of you audience members that were probably a little too dumb or haven't seen enough movies to predict the whole thing, here's the whole sequence for you. Well, during that sequence, it sounded like they kept calling the father McGraw by his last name, even though his last name is McGrath, because they constantly say McGrath through the movie. But for that one scene, it sounds like the entire time they call him McGraw, or maybe I was just hearing things. Now, when it comes to Steel in this movie, the robot, the parasite robot, well, I can understand why he is the most annoying character for some people. He didn't annoy me. There's certain moments where he did annoy me, but for the most part, I thought, he's fine. He didn't really bug me as much as most people, but I can understand people being completely annoyed with him. Maybe I was just interested enough where it's like, okay, that's a unique concept for a robot and a partnership between the hero and a robot. Maybe I was just seeing the potential in it, that I was not really looking at the actual personality of the robot and wasn't all that annoyed with him because of that. Now, when I first saw the trailer, I thought it sounded like Jesse Eisenberg. He has this sort of Jesse Eisenberg voice. Turns out it's not Jesse Eisenberg, of course. It's Josh Brenner, which I guess his voice kind of sounds like it a little bit. Anyway, it felt like Steel's personality was too many different stereotypes of robots, things that you'd expect robots to say and how to act. But it's a bunch of different stereotypes that contradict each other in a way where it's almost like, oh, we're going to make him complex, even though he's going to be a stereotype a little bit, and even though there is a different aspect of him with being a parasite and a robot and an alien. But we're going to make him more complex by having all these different stereotypes, even though they might contradict with each other. It does feel like the way Steel acts sort of feels like they have many different directions on how they wanted to do Steel, but ultimately couldn't decide one, and so they just had them all in it. First of all, Steel has amnesia in this film, so he doesn't remember things, and that becomes the main focal point of the movie, trying to figure out what happened to Max's dad. Which, of course, Steel happened to be there during the incident, and so that's how they're getting the flashbacks, because there is a link between him and Max. And so both of them are seeing the flashbacks as he starts to remember. But anyway, because he has amnesia, he does that whole amnesia thing where sometimes they do stuff, say stuff, know stuff without realizing how they know that stuff. They also have him try to be the robot thing where they act logical, think logical, talk scientific-like, try to make it sound like he's a smart robot. But at the same time, they try to make the alien stereotype where he's looking at things, doesn't understand what they do, what they are. Maybe that's because of the whole amnesia thing, so maybe I'll give that a little bit of a pass. But there is one moment where, even though he's talking about this math and he's like, oh, your teacher's teaching you the wrong thing, because obviously he knows a higher math than the teacher apparently. But at the same time, later on in the movie, towards the very end actually, he's talking to a lamp as if it was a real person, which isn't a long scene. It's just sort of like an ad-lib scene, like towards the end. It's actually really jarring because the scene isn't focused on Steele. It's about Max's mother telling him about his father, finally saying everything that his father was. And then all of a sudden it just cuts to Steele talking to a lamp. But what's really weird is there are times where he is talking like a robot. He's talking like you'd expect a robot to talk like, and things a robot would say. But then there are times where it feels like he's talking like a normal person, or at least talking like some kid that feels like they're hip. And there's plenty of moments where he does have really pointless talking, and seems like he's just talking just to talk. So yeah, he didn't annoy me as much, but I can understand how he could annoy the hell out of people. Also, for a superhero movie, it doesn't really have a lot of action, and when it does have action, it's really not that good. There wasn't really a moment in this film where I felt like this was some thrilling action scene, or, oh, this is really cool. No, it just sort of like, okay, it's an action scene, and a little poorly done, but it's action. And there's so few and far between that it doesn't feel like a superhero movie. And look, I get it. Superhero films can be different. They don't have to be all action-packed. They don't have to have a lot of major conflict. But if you don't have some major conflict, if you don't have a lot of action, you got to excel in other things in order to keep it from being boring. You got to excel at building character, building a unique story, making an internal conflict. And they try to do that. They really try to do that in this film with the backstory of the father, trying to figure out the flashback, trying to control his powers. Look, typical stuff, but they're trying to do something. But it feels like it's so scattered, it feels like it's so unfinished that it's just very underwhelming. And so when that's underwhelming and the action is underwhelming, you got a very boring superhero movie. If you can't excel at action, if you can't excel at thrilling the audience, then you have to make a deeper connection with the audience and have them care about the characters, have a good internal conflict, and it just isn't there in this movie. Like, there's essence of it, there's pieces of it, it's just not all there. Now, there's probably funnier, ridiculous things I can go into through this movie, more spoilers I could say. There's probably enough in this movie that if I went through the whole movie, I'd have enough material to make a in-depth review. But the problem with me for this movie is it wasn't as ridiculously funny as some other ridiculously bad movies this year. I mean, God's Not Dead 2 was a funnier, ridiculous bad movie. So was 9 Lives. Max Steel has a few moments where it's ridiculously hilarious, but for the most part, it's just sort of bad, not funny, good, ridiculous bad. Not the kind of bad where you can riff on it all day and have a really fun time. Max Steel's not like that. It's just sort of boring, bland bad, with a few ridiculously funny moments in it. So I'm really not going to say anything else with Max Steel. It's not an absolutely terrible, awful, 0-star movie. But for me, I'm going to give Max Steel 1 star. And that's probably pushing it. I probably could have just did a half a star, but I don't know, there's something interesting enough in the movie, and there's something that feels like it could have been good, and there's some good ideas in it. It just feels like an unfinished movie. It feels like a first draft movie. And if you tweaked it more, if you had more drafts of the film before you had a finished film, then maybe it could have been a good movie. But what we got, what this movie is, it just feels unfinished. That's all I can say. So, did you even bother seeing Max Steel? What'd you think about it? Go ahead and comment below. If you haven't seen Max Steel, what is the worst superhero movie you have ever seen? And if you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe and check out my movie reviews of 2015 and 2016. As always, this is Bruce Gifford, and this was Just My Opinion.